Hello, welcome to Scattered Thoughts, the podcast where we talk about CPDH and other magic-related things. I'm Joe.
And I'm Bobby, aka Be Fine.
And Bobby Be Fine. Yeah, we got Bobby Be Fine on the podcast. We have been gone for about a year. You'll notice the sweet overlay. It took us that year to make the overlay, and then
Yeah.
we thought that was finally good enough that we could come back. We
Yeah. We
we
spent a long year slaving over what amounts to doodles, essentially.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is we had a whole year and we got about three done. We got about three. We figured out how to use cameras in that year. Um,
Barely.
yeah, we'll see. This gonna be like my first video I edit with a camera in it in like 4 years. So hopefully that doesn't take too long and it doesn't look too terrible. But yeah, we're back. We're gonna talk about some more CPDH. We have been playing it, mostly. There's been a couple tournaments. A lot of things have changed, kind of. I mean, people are still playing the same decks, but yeah, we're here to talk about more stuff we meant to talk about forever ago. So
Yeah. But I'd say the good thing about, the wait, we've gotten to develop some of these ideas, see some of them play out, not play out.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't know. It was a good little learning year, I guess you could call it.
yeah, definitely. This whole year we were taking in-depth notes. At the front of our mind was getting back to this. Was why we took so
Yeah,
long.
every decision was with this in mind, all part of the plan.
Dude, I would be on I'm on turn 6, right? I'm like, dude, if I hit this fast win, I could talk about it on the podcast when we get back.
Just notes of hundreds of games of data.
Hundreds
Like,
of
okay, so
I have a fucking
here's my turn by turn.
thesaurus.
But yeah, no, and we're starting off, this new episode 1 / all-time episode 3, however you want to break it
Yep.
down. We got a good one to talk about, and this one's actually going to be a few parts.
Yep. Yep.
We're talking about threat assessment, everyone's favorite topic. There's
Yep. The
Everyone
thing
has-
losing everyone games, their own, other people's games. It's a great time.
Everyone thinks they're the best at it, and everyone thinks everyone else is the worst at it. There's never a perfect. No one's gonna be perfect at it. But no matter what you think, or no matter what happens, I'm never wrong. Everyone else is. And it's one of like those skills that's really tricky to perfect. But it's also arguably one of the most important parts of a multiplayer game. Working on it, getting a better feel for it is going to translate to winning more games. So
Yeah, I mean, listen, you give me that lightning bolt, I'm winning the game. That's all I'm saying. Like, my threat assessment is the one. That's what people don't understand. But it can be that much of a difference, right? Because, like, you have one removal spell, right? And there are two people that could potentially win the game in the next cycle. What do you do with it? That's a pretty difficult question, and that's why we're probably going to be talking about this for the next couple episodes, because it is really important, and like Bobby said, can be one of the most determining factors in an entire game, the way it plays out. Like, even if it's something that isn't necessarily going to save or end the game, it could be something that has very long-term ramifications. Like, your evaluation of a value piece could be the difference between that value piece getting out of hand and winning the game, or you being able to save that removal, because at the end of the game, the value piece didn't even do anything that mattered. So that kind of thing is what we're going to be getting into. But we got to start at the very beginning, because how are you going to tell what's good if you can't play Magic? So Bobby,
Right.
You want to give us the rundown? The master himself, probably top 8'd something. I feel like you told me you top 8'd something. So
I don't know. Yeah. So before we even get into like what is threat assessment, what goes into threat assessment, I guess like the important precursor to all of this is if once you're getting into competitive Magic, whether it's PDH, whether it's CDH, even just like 1v1, even though you won't really have the threat assessment conversation in the same way, you got to know how like the rules of Magic work, and that's more than just the basics. But you have to learn how priority works. You have to know how the stack works. You have to know all the different phases. You have to know all the steps. Each aspect of the game, it has some way you can take advantage of it within the rules. Like that's maybe oversimplifying it to an extent, but there are some decks that are centered around taking advantage of priority and how priority passes and how it doesn't pass. You can take advantage of that interaction wise in a game.
Yep,
Because
priority
you
bullying
have
is
someone.
a classic. Yep.
Yeah, so there are all these ways. So understanding those and knowing just how the rules of Magic work are going to make it so you have that many more opportunities to get one up on your opponents, and that's really like step one. Like if you don't fully understand, you don't have to know every like nitty gritty rule, right? Like you don't have to understand how layers work. I don't, but that's what judges are for. But
Yeah.
you got to know enough to be able to take advantage of those if you want to like get to that next level where you're like able to kind of game and just take advantage of things that are really kind of niche, and maybe that won't come up all the time, but come up enough that they make a difference.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, like you said, if you wanna get to the top, you got to start at the beginning. So make sure that you know how all these things work, so that when you're trying to apply ideas of threat assessment and how do I understand what's the biggest threat at the table, you know how to properly respond to it. Sometimes, even if you think something's the biggest threat, you can try to abuse a little more advantage with the priority system, especially like chances are if something's a big enough threat that everyone's got their eyes on it and the guy in the last seat has the counter spell, and I mean you've got a very good idea he's got a counter spell, you can ship it on over to him because that's how magic works.
Yeah,
So yeah.
we'll talk. That's not going to be the topic of this episode.
Well,
like
yeah, but
other people's stuff, but that's a good example. So I guess to break down, here's how I think of what threat assessment is. Joe and I have talked about it a little bit. I think there's like three parts that kind of go into it. You could call them steps. I don't necessarily think they're.
we need like a 3-step the like scam books where it's like these
Yeah.
7 steps to assessing your
Right.
threats.
Right. I don't think it's like a step-by-step thing, because I think you could, you don't have to do one before the other necessarily. But it's important to have them all. I think maybe 1 and 2 require having before you can get to 3. But the basic gist is number 1 is knowing your deck, whether, and that'll be what we talk about this episode, what it means to know your deck, know how to play your deck. The second prong step, layer, whatever you want to call it.
We'll get him a snappy name at some point in between these episodes.
Is knowing opposing decks. So what are my opponents doing? How are they winning? How do I stop them? Et cetera, et cetera. And then the third one is really like the one that brings all of the prereqs together, is being aware of the situation and being able to adapt, and then using all of that knowledge to politic. So kind of weaponizing all of the above in a way that benefits you in game socially. So maybe that's too simple of a breakdown, maybe that's too confusing of a breakdown, who knows, but it's kind of a clean way to break it into 3 different parts.
Yeah, that way we can get a couple episodes out of it and we'll be clean to go. So starting off with knowing your deck. Let me double check some notes here. Yeah, so the biggest thing to start about knowing your deck is just taking a very critical eye on your deck and looking at every single card. And me and Bobby were talking earlier, and he said you don't need to be able to write a 5-paragraph essay with intro, body, outro on every single card in your deck, but you should know what that card is in there to do and what that card is in there to deal with, so that you can kind of like evaluate your position at the table. Like what is my deck capable of dealing with? How does my deck win? Because through thoughts like that, you can come to conclusions like, okay, so what is a threat to my deck? You should have a very good understanding of the avenues that your deck is going to take throughout the game, and a lot of that just comes from, for starters, thinking about the cards within your deck and what each of them is going to do.
Yeah. So the big thing here, and this will vary based on whether you're brewing a deck or you're just piloting someone else's list you found. If you see a card and you don't know why it's there, I mean, I get I don't know how many times people ask me, why are you playing this instead of this? Like, I mean, Joe, you asked me, I asked you, you know, everyone does it, right? If you don't have a good answer to that, odds are good you either shouldn't be playing that card or you haven't sat down and thought about it enough.
Yeah.
You don't like Joe said. I don't think you need an essay about every card, but you should be able to defend it versus alternatives
Dude,
if you think it's worth playing.
The number of times I've legitimately heard like it's funny or something, and it's like, well, I guess if you really want to pick your cards like that, but
yeah, like there's if assuming all this is with the idea that you're playing to be as competitive as possible, you're playing to win, you should have reasons why every card makes a list and reasons why the cards that aren't in your deck don't. Those cards can still be good. Those cards can still be playable, but you should know why and why you are and aren't playing cards. And that involves knowing the like standard use of the cards, like why the main reason they're the plan A. But a lot of cards will have like corner case uses that come into play here and there that are important. I real quick like think of Gretchen, for example, right? Like I'm playing the put a +1/+1 counter on a creature land aura that also generates additional mana. Those also turn it into a combat win con, keeps my dork away from some more removal. Hydroform, I play that to get around the haste problem, but I also play it to help deal with opposing lands if I need to, because I can turn it into a creature and then someone else can kill it. So cards are often more than just what meets the eye. Reading the card does explain the card, but you got to know the context, how those come into play, how that changes, because most cards will be doing more than one thing in a deck.
Yeah, and I think another good example of that for Malcolm is like the artifact lands in that deck can trigger your artifact pingers, which means that like you can get the treasure during your combat. Then in your second main phase with all your mana, you play the pinger, you hit your land drop, which is a way of creating an artifact that has no point of interaction. So just stuff like that, where it's like there's a lot of cute little synergies in a deck typically, even if you're not running sort of like cute cards. Like good cards are often good because they will do multiple things for you. So yeah, just being very aware of all the cards in your deck and trying to think out those corner cases, because a lot of times those kinds of things are really good at winning games, because the easiest way to stop a win is when it's super obvious. And so, or like, stopping a play sometimes. It doesn't have to be a win. And so, kind of having those unexpected ways of dealing with things can be very good. Like Bobby said, I don't think most Gretchen players are ready to deal with their land being turned into a creature by any means other than a normal counterspell, So if they're ready for a specific thing and you start doing random stuff like that, there's a good chance that it is more likely to succeed than a play that they are very, very ready to deal with and have seen 1,000 times.
Yeah. And then kind of building off of this, there's reason. You also have to know. So once you know what your cards do, which is, I would say like
step one,
the base level, right? You got to know how your deck wins.
Yep.
So,
yep.
If you're a combo deck, what are my combo lines? How do I perform the combo? Once I get infinite whatever, how do I turn that into a win? What does it take for me to have? What do I need to have set up before I can do that? Like, how many pieces do I need? How do I find those pieces? How far away am I? And that's just for a combo deck, right? That's just what they need to be thinking at all times, and they need to be able to answer at all times, because one, it makes you aware of how far away you are from winning the game. It puts that clock in your head. It lets you start thinking about, okay, I'm 2 cards away. I have 1 I can tutor for in my hand right now, and I can find one of 6 different ways to find this card as I draw some cards. So you can start planning and mapping out, okay, what are my turns going to look like? When am I tutoring? What am I concerned about? And then it also helps you articulate that to other players. Like, so many people will say, oh, that person's close to comboing. And we'll talk about this in, knowing opposing decks. And they have no idea what they're talking about. They just want to paint you as a threat. And people are so quick to, hate the combo player. They're like, oh, yeah, well, if he's close to combo, I'm going to kill him. No, I can say I'm 3 pieces away.
Yep.
I have a land untapper. I don't have any way to generate an extra mana on my land. I don't have a freed. Like I'm at least 2 pieces away, if not more, depending on the type of untapper, right? So, like you need to be able to articulate it to defend yourself, because people will definitely just not know what you're doing, and if you also don't know what you're doing, you're putting yourself in the spot where you can be taken advantage of, or you can't properly defend yourself, and you lose out on that kind of equity by just being like, hey, no, I need these things, you know, and I recognize that this person over here only needs these things, which they're more likely to get, or they're closer, which is part of knowing how other people's decks work. But you got to just be able to defend yourself, defend where you're at, know where you're at, like what you're playing to. It also helps you dictate play style, you know. Like, I don't know, Joe, maybe you want to talk about this, right? Like, we've talked about Malcolm Kedis versus Malcolm Breaches, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
how play style, like...
Jesus Christ. My brain froze. I was just, like, listening to you go, and I'm like, yeah, man, dude, Bobby, he's making some great points right now, and you're, like, talking about playstyle. Oh, geez. Yeah, so, I mean, it can really determine the way you go into a game as well. I mean, this partially goes into, like, knowing your opponent's deck, but you have to kind of adjust your play and adjust how you kind of, like, view your own, how to, like, I don't want to just keep saying how close you are to a win, because not every deck combos, but, you know, other decks are close to a win through combat damage or whatever, so, like, you have to adjust your playstyle based on what you're drawing throughout the game, and that will change, you know, like Bobby was saying, how you communicate with other players. And there is nothing fishier than a player who's like, you know, someone does the classic kill the combo player, he's gonna combo, and you're like, well, well, not really. And it's like, if you can't, you know, tell people, okay, I need to play my commander for 5 mana because it was killed once and costs extra mana, and also I only have 2 counter spells in hand because I mulled the 6 and then played a mana rock and then cast like a cantrip that led to nothing. So like, yeah, you really have to like kind of like change it based on the current game state, and communicating that other players will help a lot.
And I guess one thing I want to point out here too, you know, knowing what playstyle your deck wants to be doing, knowing what playstyles your deck can be doing are also both very important. Like I mentioned when I handed it over to you there, Malcolm Kedis versus Malcolm Breaches is an example.
Yep.
This comes up all the time because I like Malcolm Breaches. I think it's the best blue-red Malcolm deck. People can fight me. I don't really care. It's a control deck. You're not trying to win on turn 3 or turn 4. You're not in it to win fast. Sometimes you can draw those hands and you go for it because you can, and that's awesome. And, you know, sometimes you win. But the deck is made to grind. It's meant to take it slow. It's meant to just get value out of Breaches. It's meant to play Malcolm eventually when it's safe or when you're going for the win. You're not trying to turbo out Malcolm and get a bunch of treasures because you really don't want to have to dedicate that much mana to Malcolm later in the game. So people, you know, will ask me about the deck and be like, oh, why aren't you running, you know, fast mana? Why aren't you running more tutors? Why aren't you blah, 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 blah? And it's like, because I'm going to win the long game. That's what I built the deck for. That's how I've made my list. If you want to play faster, I don't think Breaches is the deck for you. You can try to build Breaches that way. That's fine, whatever. But knowing why, like, knowing that's how the deck is played gives so much background into every card choice, every, you know, decision you make playing the deck. If you're playing the deck to be a fast combo deck, you are not going to do well with that like the list as I have it, because it's not meant to do that. And so that's why, you know, when you're picking up a deck and say someone else has, you know, you're just picking up someone else's list. You're not brewing something. If someone has a primer, read it. You know, it's probably pretty insightful for them. You know, there's so many good primers on Moxfield that I've read.
Yeah, if someone takes the time to write a primer, it's usually because they know enough to be writing it. And I've never read a primer that wasn't worth my time, even if I didn't completely agree with every point. So I definitely, read the primer, try to understand like where the deck is coming from, and that goes back to the first point of just like every single card, you should at least have a general idea, justification to what that card's doing there. So even if you net deck, the primer can help that. Maybe you thought, oh, this is the stupidest include I've ever seen in my life. Turns out, you know, it works really well with whatever the deck has going on. And moving over to the, we were talking about transitioning between plan A and plan B. it came into my mind because Bobby, you were talking about how Malcolm Breaches. It's like, you don't really want to view the deck as a turbo deck because that's just not really what it's trying to do all the time. But he did mention that sometimes the hands come together, and that's also a really good idea of knowing your deck. Is that like Gretchen also not a turbo list by any means. It wants to generate more value than anyone knows what to do with and grind things out, get a million cards, and just be so far ahead in all of these little advantages. But in the same way, that deck can also randomly draw God hands that could win on turn 2 or turn 3. Same with Malcolm Breaches. If you're looking at your hand and it's 3 of your 1 mana interactive spells and what's the name of the 2 mana instant win one?
Reckless Fireweaver.
You have a Reckless Fireweaver and you got a Trickery Charm, and you're like, fuck it, Sometimes you just gotta go for it. So that's another thing about knowing your deck is sometimes it's nice to know that those edge cases of where your deck can lead. Sometimes even like fastier decks can grind out well. If you build like Malcolm Kedis a certain way with more like a little bit more interaction and draw spells, you can have a deck where like, hey, this deck might be aiming to go faster, but it still has this game plan in the long game, and sometimes you draw those hands where you might want to adjust. I'll hold off on playing Malcolm because I have some good value cards in hand, and I could probably take this game a little longer than I normally would. So that all goes back into knowing your deck even more, and knowing about your plan A and your plan B and what each of those requires, and kind of like, what your hand is kind of leading you towards. Because sometimes you would really love to do one, and it's not the cards. It's a card game.
Yeah, and if you're taking a list from someone else, have those conversations with them. If you have questions. But one of the things I think you should be doing when you look at a list, don't just go in at like, oh, why is this in here? Why is this in here? Like, take a second and ask yourself why it's in there, right? Like, one deck that you and I talked about a lot recently, because I think it's really cool, is I think Craze Dates or Mr. Craze Dates Rocco Seeker's Counter deck, right?
Beautiful. Like, bon appetit.
That deck, the primer is awesome. It describes why basically every card's in there.
Yep.
You gotta. It's not your typical type of combo deck. So, but like as you goldfish, as you play, like, oh, this card is in here to do like 8 different things. This is awesome. And like that's a really good one where reading the primer helps you gain so much respect for the deck and every single choice that goes into it. And odds are good. Most decks, they may not have like that level because that deck, like Joe said, it's work of art.
Dude, yeah, he said it best in his primer. He said, "This is my Mona Lisa," and I agree. Yeah. Normally, I would call people insane for calling a Pauper Commander deck their Mona Lisa, but that guy, I don't know, man. That's just, it's beautiful. It belongs in a museum.
It really is, and we'll try to include the link in the description. But but yeah, like odds are good. Like the person who built the deck put some level of thought into those decisions. Maybe they didn't, maybe you got the one person who just like, yep, I just threw some cards together. Well, in that case, hey, I could probably build a better deck than them. Like I can make changes, but you got to have that conscious decision making, and you got to think to yourself, why am I playing this card, without just having someone else explain it to you? Because you got to take that critical step yourself too, and that'll also help you when it comes to tweaking lists. Making changes, shifting from one card to another. Like, oh, is this just better than this because of XYZ, right? Like, there's enough of that where you can do some of it. Some people will have stuff online, but you got to do some of it on your own too, which involves kind of knowing how your deck operates. In addition, just as important as knowing how you win is also knowing how do you lose, or what are your deck's biggest weaknesses.
Yep. Those kind of like the silver bullet type cards that can come out of nowhere. I mean, really obvious examples are any kind of like Suture Priest type effect, and you're playing Abdel, or any Flicker deck really. Just like those ones are really obvious, but there can be less obvious ones. Like maybe your deck is a combo deck and just can't deal with onboard interaction. And the blue player goes turn 1 Island Seal of Removal, and you instantly think, I cannot combo while that is on the field. And that might change your deck building, or it might change the way you play. Who knows? But just knowing thoughts like that of like, what are the things that just really screw over my deck?
It should change both. It should change how you build a deck. It should change how you play. Like you should have, if you have a card that just beats you, you should probably have a way to interact with or stop that card.
Yeah, if one plays down and you're just completely screwed and the game is over, something tells me either your deck is terrible or it just needs a couple new cards, probably. Something just like, oh, maybe it needs a little bit of artifact removal because you're running a Flicker deck and everyone started playing Relic of Progenitus again, which I have been seeing. Thank God, people are playing Relic again. Just a little bit, at least a little bit. Although people keep popping it. I've won like 3 games when there was a Relic in play within 3 turns and I'm playing Tatty, and by the time I'm comboing, it's just gone somehow.
It's awesome.
This is
as a Flicker player.
Wrong episode for this, but people, please stop popping your relics against graveyard decks because it screws them so bad.
That's perfect for next episode.
Yeah, that's next episode.
But yeah, like there's you got to know what your deck is weak to. Mm-hmm. You got to know how you can answer that so you don't just like get deer caught in headlights. Oh, I'm Flicker and now I have an Honored Heirloom, and the player is always leaving 2 mana up, and I have a Relic, and I have to try to win through both of those.
Yep.
You should have a plan for that. That'll happen in games. Maybe that exact scenario won't happen often, but if there's ever, there's rarely a situation where you just flat out can't win.
Yep.
And you should have ways to finagle out of most, if not every situation. It's an impossible goal, probably, but I try to build with that in mind. I want to have an answer to everything. I want to be able to always have a way to win. I never want to be in a spot where I'm in a pod and I don't think I can ever win ever.
Yep.
It's the worst feeling. I don't like building decks like that. I've played decks like that and it feels awful. So,
yeah, I typically like playing a game of Magic and not just rolling dice when I sit down. So.
Right. So, when you think of go wide decks, right, you need to have anti-sweeper stuff. You got to be able to beat Crypt Rats, Pestilence, Fiery Cannonade, etc., etc. So you got to have stuff that makes your stuff indestructible or buffs, toughness or prevents damage or
yep.
It's just thinking about those, building them in a number where you're going to see them enough to cover how often you think you're going to run into the other enough. You don't need to overload on things unless it's a make it or break it. But you don't want to just have one, especially in a deck that doesn't tutor, because then, you're just hoping you get it the one time you need it and you don't have any way to tutor up. That's not the best strategy either. So.
Yeah, one thing I thought of that has come up a lot more recently, I feel like, because Black keeps getting them printed, something that a lot of decks lose to that you really want to think about, I think sometimes is the mono black edict piles. Because at this point there are so many edicts and a bunch of them are one-sided, and honestly they're really good at slowing the game down, especially versus certain decks. If your deck's plan is usually to slam down your commander on turn 2 or 3 and start accruing value off of it, that can get really, really destroyed by someone playing a Tithing Blade or a Force of Confession, whatever the new one is, or any of the classics. Yeah. So those can be really annoying and are just something that I think has popped up more recently. I've seen that I really think decks should have a plan into that. Specifically, if you think I typically have one creature hanging around and it can't die, you might want to even start, including some more creatures or thinking about things like that. I mean, that's obviously why edicts are rough because you can't really run protection for them specifically, but yeah.
Yeah, and that's, like I talked about at the beginning, all this kind of is interwoven together because a lot of that is also knowing opponents' decks, but you can't have one of these without the other if you want to be successful, right? You got to be aware of what other people are doing because that directly relates to how you lose and what you're weak to, and so how you build your own deck. So they kind of feed off of one another. So we're kind of touching on both at the same time. Just next week we'll end up almost certainly talking about some of this again in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super important, and it'll lead to you having more thoughts going through your brain as you're making card decisions is probably a good thing.
Yeah, just
using
going
your
on
noodle
Box
is a
Field
good
and
thing.
clicking the plus button over and over again on the cards that look shiny. As fun as it is, usually won't lead to the best deck that could have been made there,
Yeah. So, so we talked about, kind of worrying about losing, worry about not winning. We talked about plan A and plan B. It's one thing, you talked about we talked about like the hand where you're like, hey, you have the nuts hand to go for an early combo.
Yep. Or the opposite, where you have like, I got the value hand for some reason, so I gotta play for value this game, you know?
There's also a point where, often decks will have multiple plans. Not every deck. Some decks are, all right, my plan is I'm going to bash this person's face in, and then I'm going to bash the other person's face in, and then I'm going to bash the other person's face in. And, like, that's your plan, and that's fine. But in, like, combo control decks, right? Like, I'm thinking of my Cormella list or Malcolm Breaches, where they're pinger control decks that have combo finishes. There are game plans where, like, I know I'm never going to resolve my combo through, like, the 3 other combo players. Yeah. And, like, knowing that, or, like, I get stopped a few times, and I'm just in on the pingers. Like, we've whittled away everyone's life total. I can just start casting spells and just getting there because people just let their life totals get too low. It happens a lot, and that's, like, the cool thing about pinger decks in this one specific example. But knowing, like, you got to know what the different plans your deck has are. You gotta know, okay, when might it make sense for me to transition plans in the future, and how do I facilitate plan B while also still moving towards plan A? Because oftentimes they're gonna have some overlap. They're gonna play nice with one another, because that means your deck is gonna feel better. Like, it's not gonna feel like this disjointed pile of cards that have, we can talk about Disciple of Deceit. Like, that deck has a few different combo lines. They don't always play the nicest, but some of them do. And if you play the deck, and you can draw some hands that are wonky, that just have, like, why are these cards all in my hand?
Yep.
And there are a few decks that are kind of similar. And so, like, those are the types of situations and the types of decks where you need to have an awareness of, okay, here's all my different plans. Here's when I should make, this one a priority versus the other, and it's just case dependent. It's where, what you draw, where you're at in the pod, who all's in the pod. Again, getting into, like, situational awareness and what other people are doing, but knowing how your plans work and when you need to shift away or to them.
Yeah, and pingers are just a super easy example, because at least I think probably they're the best plan B in the format right now, just because they are so easy and they're a part of so many combos. It's just like knowing how your plan B and A fit together can really help, because just with them as a good example, you have a pinger in your hand, right? And you're playing a deck that needs to use this pinger as a combo win con, but then, you look at your deck and you think about it for a second, and you're not drawing any counter spells. You're not drawing any protection. There's no way you're going to force this win through. Sometimes, you can just, like, sit on those in your hand and, not play them out into possible removal because people are worried about them. Or if there's a deck that, throws around a lot of edicts, and these things are really important to the late game of your plan B that you think you're going to go towards, that goes back to changing your playstyle and just really considering, maybe I wait until the dust has settled and someone went for a win attempt that didn't work because I drew, like, 4 lightning bolts, basically, in my starting hand. So all I was good for a while was stopping other people. And then at the end, you have a couple draw spells, you put down your pingers, and you kind of finish everyone off. So, that just goes to knowing exactly how your game plans can kind of end up needing, like, what's the situation in which this backup plan needs to come up. And if you kind of start getting hints of that plan right away, you don't have to wait till turn, like, 7 to realize that your combo's not happening and your pinger's dead because you played him out into an edict. You really want to start thinking about these things early, and like we've been saying, it's the name of the episode. This is all about knowing your deck, how these things all fit together, and that lets you really make these judgments on threat assessment in relation to your deck, because that's going to give you a higher win rate. That's just how it is. If you understand how your deck, fits into the world of the 4-player pod, and how certain things are going to fuck you or certain things are going to work out well for you. I mean, there's certain weird things like, how much does my deck care about certain value things? If I'm threatening a win next turn, sometimes there's weird things where it's like, talking up someone else's threat because you know that your deck is in an insane position to win if you just untap. So little things like that, just like knowing your deck in and out.
It also lets you save a bunch of resources.
Yep.
Like, so often when you're playing a deck and you're like, oh, I'm tunnel visioned on this plan A, you can start tutoring for certain cards. You can start making decisions thinking you're going to go for it. And that plan A might have been dead in the water 2 turns ago, and you just don't realize it.
Yep.
And so the sooner you're able to realize that, you can capitalize on it. You can save resources. You can better allocate them. And part of this is semi-related. It's kind of not. It's kind of off topic, but part of this is, it lets you make your decisions faster, which helps save you resources. You can spend more time focusing on what other people are doing, which plays into our next topic. And you can avoid those situations where you get called out and you don't have a good answer because you don't fully understand where you're at. You'd be like, no, I'm this person over here is a blink spell away from winning the game. I need a land aura, and I don't have a way to get around the haste problem for my untapper. So, no, I'm not as scary as this other person. Sure, I'm scary-ish. Like, if you want to be, I don't blame you for thinking I'm somewhat scary. But let's not lose sight of who's actually the problem right now versus who could be a problem in like 2 or 3 turns. Like, there's a difference there.
Yeah.
And so
there is a sense of like knowing when you're a theoretical threat and when you're an actual threat. Because there are times when you're sitting there with 5 cards and someone's like, that dude's going to win next turn. And you look down and it's 4 lands and a lightning bolt. And you're like, no, really, really not that. And being able to specifically say those pieces like we've been saying, yeah, it's really great.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it just saves you a lot. It puts you in a better position. And it lets you, once you're comfortable in your own shoes, comfortable in what your deck's doing, you can spend so much more time focusing on other people. You can get a better idea of what doing. Like, spend time on opponents' turns, figure out what they're doing, and also playing what you're doing. Don't just be a goldfish. Don't just, so often people will just, like, draw a card and think they, like, have not thought through their turn at all. And it's like, come on, you had 3 people's turns to think about what you're going to do. And your cards didn't change that much. You can guess and make some assumptions as to what you're going to draw, and you can have different plans for what you draw. Start thinking through those. Like, the time is a resource in CPDH as well, in any kind of constructed format. Like, there are timers in those. So all of this, familiarity and comfortability and just knowledge of your deck lets you capitalize on that resource too, where other people are not. Because you need to be able to communicate effectively and quickly, know what you're looking for quickly, effectively, and make decisions quickly and effectively. Because that's, control decks especially, right? People are, control's slow. It can't win. It can't close out games. Every time I've played,
Aaron is searching, can't close out a game in an hour and a half. It's like, you're not swinging with all your creatures. Just attack people. Like,
yeah, like I know what I am worried about killing. I know who I'm going to attack. Like, I know what my decisions are 2 turns in advance, right? Like, that's an exaggeration, but like, I'm thinking that far in advance with my decisions and like what I'm planning for. And if you're only ever thinking about, okay, what am I doing at this exact moment? You were just throwing so much away and throwing away so much equity you could have. So spend time thinking on your opponent's turns. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you draw a card.
Dude, yeah. And with the way some of these people, they pick up their card for turn and they look at it, it's like they're Gretchen and they're top decking Freed every turn and being like, oh, I could go for it now. Like, it really goes a long way. Even just like 1 second of just like, okay, these are my cards. Like, I usually just like, when I pass my turn, I'll just thinking about like what I just did, what continues with what I'm doing. You know what I mean? Like, I know that my deck wants to move towards this. I just did these steps towards it. So what steps can I accomplish next turn? Just stuff like that.
Yeah. So all of these are just ways to, think about the game as you're playing. Think about the game before you're playing. My biggest tip is goldfish your deck before you play it to know how it feels, know how it plays out, know why your cards are there. But all of these are just kind of like, I want to kind of say the bare minimum, right? Knowing how your deck works. Because if you don't know how your deck works, you're going to spend too much time floundering and you'll lose. And that's going to happen. And part of, everyone has to learn their deck. This isn't saying you need to be a master the first time you play your deck. That's unrealistic. But if you go into a deck having no idea if you go into a game deck for the first time, you have no idea how it wins, you're doing yourself a disservice. You're doing the table a disservice. Like, just don't do it. Spend a little bit of time. Do the research. Take the time. Think through it, and have a game plan when you're sitting down at a table with a deck is really what it boils down to. So.
Yeah. Were there any other topics that we meant to touch on that were related to this? We have a Sanctuary shout out, but was there anything we missed? Oh, the one little point was just to consider what we had divided attention, limited card. Oh yeah. Just the idea is that like you have to make all these decisions, and your attention will be divided between players. But not only that, you have one hand in a Magic game that now has 4 hands. So you only have access to a quarter of the cards available at the start of the game. Obviously people draw cards in different amounts, but resources are just very tight in a game of Commander, and you really need to understand that. And that can also very largely play into your deck of just like, if you're playing a deck that has like a very limited amount of removal spells, you need to know that because you need to know how many threats your deck typically needs to take care of. Whereas if you're playing Aranus Urchin, you're going to shoot anything that moves that is vaguely, and I mean, you just shoot everything that moves in that deck. But, like understanding that you are kind of fighting an uphill battle card advantage wise, and you need to understand what your deck does about that situation.
Which is why you don't shoot everything. But, But yeah, like that's the one thing, and we maybe briefly touched on this. It's unique to multiplayer in a way,
and it's hard. It's difficult.
It's not against 1v1, right? There's so many people. There's so many like variables. Like humans alone are like a billion variables in of themselves without adding cards and decisions to the mix.
Yep.
So there it's 1v1. You already have to worry about threat assessment by like kind of gaming what you think they have. Adding 2 more people and how they're going to interact with the other people too, and there's and that's not even getting into the political side of trying to make deals and leveraging one person against another or one person's scariness against someone else. Like there are just so much. That's why it's like impossible to perfect, right? You'll never have perfect information. You'll never be able to make a right decision every single time. Anyone who's telling you otherwise is a liar.
Except for
facts.
Bobby, because I have it on good authority. Bobby has told me he's never wrong. I have made many decisions that worked out for me, and Bobby said, well, I don't quite know about that. And I don't know.
I'm never wrong. Beside from me, I'm the anomaly. So if someone else is telling you they're never wrong.
Unless you were sitting across from motherfucking Bobby B. Fine, you are wrong, is what he's saying.
No, and I'm wrong all the time, too. So, but yeah, like, you'll never be able to fully make a perfect decision every time, every single game, because it's impossible to know whether or not that's the case. You can always go back in hindsight and say, oh, you should have done this, you should have done why. I'm guilty of it. Every other player is guilty of it. Everyone wants to point the blame on somewhere else, somewhere on someone else or on something else that happened. But at the end of the day, you'll make mistakes. You'll make decisions based on limited information, and they'll end up being the wrong decision. And maybe that's okay that it was the wrong decision because you only had so much information. So, I think it's really unique to this kind of multiplayer format.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that. I think the big thing about that is just making sure that you think about it. If you chose the wrong target, just think critically about the decisions that made you think about that. Kind of, like, I killed the wrong creature. What were my reasons? And if they don't hold up in hindsight, to a degree, obviously it's really easy to say you were wrong in hindsight because now you have perfect information, but kind of imagine that world where you had that imperfect information and the conclusions you drew and think, do those hold up? That's a really easy way to go back and, not just say like, oh, this guy's an idiot. He counterspelled the wrong thing. You have that amount of, sway in the game as well. And you have to do what you can, and really blaming other people only goes so far. It's just not a great habit as far as like seriously considering to, win the game. You can joke about it and think about what other people did, but at the end of the day, you should really have a critical eye when you look at your own plays and think about how the game went down.
Yeah, every game, win or lose, you're gonna have situations where you thought, "Well, I could have done something different."
Yep.
And the important thing is win or lose. Like you can win and still have made decisions that maybe you shouldn't have, and you just gotta think about those. And they're not always gonna be obvious, and that's okay. And you can make decisions that are bad, and they can still be okay and completely defensible.
Yep.
Because you had what you had when you made it, right? So,
yeah, I mean, there's like a classic one of just like, I mean, first of all, don't run sorcery speed removal largely, but you have a sorcery speed removal in your hand, and it's flipping around the turn, and you look down, and there's 2 people with combo pieces on the board, and you're like, well, one of these guys is going to combo, and I have to remove something. Oops, you picked the wrong one.
Or you attack the wrong person. You take out the wrong person, you lose the other one.
Yep.
And you find out it didn't matter which one you killed because the other one was going to kill you, right? So, like, sometimes it doesn't matter. And you basically just need to, just like you have to have a reason for every card in your deck, you should have a reason for every decision you make.
Yeah.
And be able to defend it. And it can be wrong later. But as long as you had a good enough reason, I don't think there's, That's step 1, is having a good enough reason, and then learning from each one of those situations where, like, maybe the wrong decision is made over time.
Yep.
But yeah, I don't think I think that covers it. I don't have any other.
Yeah, that was pretty good. I think we got a good amount of time, so I think we can just. Actually, first, I did want to openly apologize on camera for the quality of my audio. Despite going to college for this and working at the largest live sound company in the world, there's no defeating recording in a room that is like a literal fucking cave and is just a big empty tunnel. So my audio is just going to sound like shit for a little bit. I'll try to see if I can figure it out, but yeah, I mean, echoes are echoes. This is miserable to record in, but we wanted to record anyway. Like we said, we got these, I almost said layovers. When we were...
Yeah, we're flying. We're on a flight.
We're flying over. When we were talking about, we were like planning out the episode, I was talking about the intro. I kept saying layovers. And Bobby was like, Joe, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not flying anywhere anytime soon, so I don't know what you're talking about. I know you were in Japan a year ago.
Yeah,
so
well, actually, I was in a layover this whole time. I got stuck in the airport for a year. But anyway, we just wanted to shout out the upcoming Sanctuary tournament. Like I said, it has been like years since I've edited anything with a video, so I kind of doubt that it will be out before the tournament, which is this weekend, 16th, right?
Yes. Yeah, so it's the March 16th, 1 p.m. Eastern. We're recording it a couple days ahead of that. Depending on when this comes out, you should either register if you haven't, or watch along if you haven't. There'll be commentary all day. Myself, Brad of the PDH Pod, and Derek of the PDH Rules Committee will all be talking throughout the day. Maybe a few other people dropping in and out. We'll see. But yeah, it should be a good, fun time. There's 20 people signed up as of right now. I hope that number grows a little bit between now and then.
Is that the biggest yet?
Yeah, well, 20 is our biggest so far.
Nice.
But I want to get a couple more. I want to keep it growing, keep it moving in the right direction.
That doesn't include me yet. So you have, assuming I don't get called into work, which is why I haven't regged yet, you do have one more from me.
Yeah. So if you're a slacker like Joe, sign up now. Stop waiting.
I'm not a slacker. My job sucks. I'm not.
But yeah, it should be, regardless of whether you get to play, whether you want to watch, whatever. Should be a good, fun time. The VOD will go up afterwards. People will be talking about it, I'm sure. There will be hopefully cool decks that win. But yeah, I'm excited for it. It should be fun. I'm excited for April. Riches to Rags is sold out in Philly. We're both going to be there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cool stuff in the works and coming up. So, and we'll almost certainly talk about all that stuff as they happen. But yeah. If you aren't in the Sanctuary server, join it. We'll have links and stuff, I'm sure, or just go to sanctuarypdh.com. Real easy. And then that wraps up for me. I don't know if you have anything else you want to talk about.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I just want to say, feel free to join Sanctuary, even if you're not planning on, or this is after the event. We play random games there all the time. I'm in the random looking for games more than Bobby is, but yeah, they're a great time. So feel free to hop in. Pretty much all I have.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well then, we'll call it there. I don't know if we ever decided who does the outro stuff, but
I don't even know if we had an outro. I was just gonna say we'll see you for part 2 in probably a couple years, and by then maybe Wizards will have released a new commander that is actually competitive viable. That's what I'm waiting on. Eventually they're gonna fuck up and do it. I'm just waiting for it. They'll do it.
One of these days.
We just need another D&D set, dude. We just need another D&D set.
I mean, we'll probably get one next week with how fast they release it. So, but yeah, no, thanks everyone for listening. Let us know if you have thoughts, comments, whatever. All comments and criticisms about audio and video should be addressed to Joe and Joe specifically. So blow him up. But yeah,
give him my ad on Discord. Give him my email, my personal phone number. I want a voicemail if you think my audio sounds like shit.
I'll give you a social. But yeah, thanks for listening. We appreciate it, and we'll be back to talk about more threat assessment in, who knows, next episode. So.
Yep. Bye-bye.
See ya.